Okay, hello everyone. Today is August the 3rd, also known as Friendship Day. And we're going to be making a new friend today because our guest is making his Green Builder Media webinar series debut. Now we're going to be talking about building and designing homes with resilient solutions. You know, it's more critical now than ever given homeowner expectations and climate concerns. I was just reading an article yesterday that focused on home buyers and how they are now factoring the local climate when choosing a place to live. So today we're going to be covering relevant trends that impact resiliency in buildings and the benefits of using resilient building materials for wall design, home ventilation, renovation, and more. And finally, we'll review best practices for rebuilding after natural disasters while keeping resiliency in mind. Our guest today is Neil Friedberg, Building Science Manager for LP Building Solutions. Neil graduated from Texas A&M Kingsville with a degree in architectural engineering. He's worked in the building science field for over 10 years, and throughout that time, his responsibilities and interests have included providing quality assurance and quality control for materials in residential and commercial buildings, modeling with hydrothermal, energy, and HVAC, and measuring and censoring homes for their actual performance. Now, this webinar sponsor is LP Structural Solutions, designed to defend your build come hail or high water, fire, or heat. The LP Structural Solutions portfolio of high-performance building products includes subflooring and sheathing materials that help you build better. With easy installation procedures and industry-leading warranties, LP helps you take the future of building into your own hands with premium solutions and exceptional support. Now, to ask questions of our guest today, simply use the questions box on the right side of your screen, more than likely, to send in your questions. Now, I'm going to review those questions and I'm going to pose those to Neil during the Q&A time set aside after his presentation. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone, for joining. As Mike said, we're going to be talking about building with resilient solutions. So overall, we're going to be talking about resiliency, what to do, what do exactly resilient materials do, rebuilding after natural disasters and other resilient concerns, and of course, building for resiliency. So why talk about resiliency? So Homeowner Trends. This is one of the biggest changes in our industry in a long time. Healthy, resilient homes outrank prioritized living. One of the biggest keys is that more people are working from home, COVID being one of the major reasons. People in homes also move less. We are now seeing a over 10-year home ownership versus the previous 7 years that we used to be on average. Homeowners' perspective is all homes are and should be efficient. So that's one of the biggest changes in home buyer perspective is a lot of people are being raised in semi-efficient homes, and when they're going to purchase homes, regardless of age, they expect homes to be equally as efficient. So that's one of the biggest perspectives in home buying right now. So retrofit is going to be a big concern, especially for resiliency. And then your new homeowners are now mainly millennials and soon to be Gen Z. One of their biggest concern is how resilient is the home, whether it be for the constant awareness of climate change that's happening to the environment. So how will this house withhold or withstand the changes in the environment? And also, where are they building, right? A lot of us have been seeing flooding areas, and a lot of people are concerned about living in those areas now. And then the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration has basically said in the last 20 billion events. And of those 20 events, it was a total of about 74 billion in damages. So weather is becoming a much bigger concern for not just homeowners, home builders, insurances too. So what do resilient building materials do? So one of the things that they do is create a system to allow a builder to mitigate risk. I say this because when you are actually building a wall, it is no longer the components of which you built it with, right? So regardless of the sheathing, the facade, the system, whether it be a WRB or vapor barrier on the inside, depending on where you're building, including the insulation in the cavity, right? So all those separate components are great individually, but when you put them together, is that system good for what you're doing? Is that system good for the environment you're building it in, or how that building is being occupied? All these things cause buildings to operate differently. The biggest variable being the occupant, right? So you can have occupants who expect really low temperatures. You have occupants that prefer it to be warmer. You also have occupants who refuse to turn on the exhaust fan in their bathroom, allowing that moisture to accumulate over time. So one thing that I like to talk about is when you're building as a home builder or a homeowner building your own home, one of the things that I recommend looking into is how the system that you're implementing affects the building as a whole, including orientation, location, drainage, right? All these aspects affect the materials you're using. One of the things I constantly talk to people is look up their local flood administration data. It's either provided by FEMA or even the county that you're building in. This helps understand where you are building and what the potential of flooding is on the map. So when you're looking at specific materials, you're basically designing a system, like I said earlier. And walls, whether builders know it or not, are really focusing on four things, right? They're looking at sound, air sealing, moisture, and airflow. Now, some of these correspond with each other really well, right? So if you can stop airflow, you can stop moisture. If you have better air sealing, you can reduce sound transmission. And when you're looking at all these things, and maybe not particularly, maybe you're just looking at, okay, well, I know that it rains and I need to wrap my house with something that's going to prevent moisture from coming in. Great. But picking that right system for you, for the builder, possibly for the homeowner, is much more key than just to picking a material. People tend not to realize that as they enclose systems or as they put things together, it becomes harder to control some variables, whether it be sound, air, moisture, airflow. Because there's a lot of people who touch those walls, from plumbers to electricians, windows installers, people who are installing the facades, whether it be a siding material, a brick material, a stucco. There's a lot of holes being poked into a system. So you want to make sure that that system is resilient itself. One of the things that I always explain to people, airflow in walls is not good. Airflow over a sheathing is much better. So this would be considered a rain screen to most people. This allows any potential bulk water that lands on there to dry off. So when you're designing your walls, it's not just the immediate interior part, it's the exterior from the facade, ventilation, all the way into the gypsum and paint. Depending on where you are, some people allow for vapor barrier paint, some people don't. It just depends on where you're building exactly. But once you close it up, that wall is a system. Other things that we need to consider when you're looking at materials is home ventilation. So one of the things that I like to tell people is you can't build a house tight enough. If it's basically a plastic bag, that'd be great. But with that, we need to control fresh air based on the building's needs, including the people. Verify that the building doesn't leak or doesn't let air in that's not supposed to, because that's going to bring in dust, mold, allergens, moisture, all kinds of things that affect the building. Other things that we need to look at is energy. So a resilient home will be moderately energy efficient. So some places may require an ERV, an energy recovery ventilation system, or a heat recovery ventilation system. In some areas, climate zone, upwards of 3 to 5 may require both. There may be benefits in having a dual system. Another thing is renovation. So when you're renovating a building, one of the things that I always recommend people do is understand the materials that were used previously. I say that because it's not as easy as saying, oh, I'm going to tear down the inside and slap up something on the inside and it'll be perfect. If you mess up a building, especially older homes, you may end up causing efflorescence or scalding based on some old stone, warping of old wood, especially if you're trying to maintain some sort of look, or if the home that you're renovating is considered I'm sorry, I've lost the word, but an older home that you're trying to maintain. So things that I like to tell people is understand what materials were used, understand what moisture content things are in, and then build from there. A majority of the time, in my experience, especially people within inner cities or cold areas, I always recommend to dehumidify large stone buildings, partly because there's a lot of moisture in that wall, and if you were to close it up, it no longer is flowing in any specific direction, and you can build up a lot of moisture, causing a lot of issues, both structurally and to the facade. So that's always one of the items that I like to touch on. And then on top of that, like I said earlier, comfort is one of the biggest things that is hard to pinpoint because it is a subjective goal. The occupant basically picks whatever feels right, feels comfortable, and can go from there. Whether it be discomfort due to humidity, temperature, sound, smell, especially in multifamily, compartmentalization is key. And then, of course, you have to do this all while maintaining some sort of semblance of energy efficiency. That way the home is actually still livable as far as cost. So rebuilding after a natural disaster. If a natural disaster occurs, it is likely that it's a majority flooding where homes can be recuperated, and it is critical to rebuild the property as fast as possible to prevent a multitude of extra damage. So in my experience with several floods in the Texas area, we've become, I guess, somewhat good at understanding what's needed. For those who aren't, my suggestion is this, is always get power. Get power as soon as possible. And it's mainly to set up dehumidification systems in the house. Your air conditioner probably won't work, especially if it's a ground unit, and just get moisture out of that air is probably one of the biggest key things in surviving some sort of flooding event, some sort of massive water event, whether it be a large leak. These things can be detrimental to buildings. So remove moisture and remove it fast. Another thing I like to recommend is, depending on, it being a flood, remove the gypsum off the wall, open it up, get air movement in there. Also removing insulation. I think FEMA, if I remember correctly, recommends in 4-foot increments. That way you can just replace with a full sheet. So I will recommend that. Also, this getting things opened up is going to help reduce the event of mold growth, clearing out furniture that is going to be discarded anyways, and of course discard things properly, and then going through whatever treatment necessary for mold inhibitor, microcides, things like that. It really does affect the home and quality in the future. And if you're dealing with insurance, document everything. Take pictures of it all. So considerations for buildings. One of the things that I like to recommend is a wall system that dries in, first of all, both directions and allows for fast drying. So depending on where you are, you may require some sort of rain screen. And that's fine. My suggestion is, regardless of if you're required, you should have a rain screen. Something that allows bulk water to escape the cavity between the sheeting and then whatever facade you have. One of the reasons why is because if moisture can sit against whatever material you have there, whether it be a house wrap, a sheeting board, it can accumulate and potentially find a path through some sort of mechanical fastener. So I'm a big fan of gaps to allow airflow, and of course have the appropriate screen at the bottom and top to actually allow that airflow to pass through freely. So if you're installing brick, be careful with mortar buildup behind the brick, because that can just stop airflow and accumulate water. When you have siding, if you install some sort of furring strip or a ventilation system, it'll allow for drying and screening of water. And of course, your stucco, when you have the dual layer, it allows for rapid drainage. All this to say that a majority of construction litigation is about 70% due to moisture infiltration, 40% roofing, 30% walls. So when you're looking at liability, 70% of that is due to moisture intrusion. So that speaks loads to what happened. It is a large risk. Annually, I think it's like 3.6 billion, if I remember correctly, on a claim. So about 1 in 50 homes has some sort of moisture claim annually. So it's not about if it's going to happen, it's more about when it's going to happen, and making sure that when you're designing or building a home, you're looking at things that can be resilient, can dry in both directions, can remove water as fast as possible, rather than hold water and accumulate. With that. So one of the products that we use is LP WeatherLogic. It is an air and moisture barrier managing system and a structural board. So other resilient concerns, which is fire. So as we've seen, fire has become a bigger issue. It amazed me when I flew into Minneapolis, St. Paul last week, that there was haze, and it was from a combination of Canadian and Californian fire being blown into the area. So one of the things that fire does is most of the time, it would be considered almost a total loss of a building for a fire. So when it comes to that, if it falls under the water damage area, then I recommend following the water damage steps, right? Getting power, moving things out, draining, cleaning as fast as possible. But one of the things that fire does is typically completely destroys homes, whether by smoke, complete destruction. So one of the things that when building in like a WUI zone, a wildlife urban interface zone, is looking at things that, one, are sustainable, but then two, are fire resistant. So in multifamily wall systems, you would use a material that can help prevent flame spread, whether it be from the surrounding environment or even from unit to unit. So these areas are of high concern, especially for builders, whether it be a complex, a duplex, or an apartment complex like this, what you see here. So one of the things I always recommend people is to understand, especially builders, is to understand the UL wall rating system. UL has many walls that have qualified for ratings. It has a specific hour rated system, anywhere between 1 to 4 in most buildings that I've seen, depending on height and occupancy. But yeah, so using the appropriate materials for that is one of the things that is great to consider. Here you have a fire-resistant board that is anywhere between 1 and 2 hour rated for wall assemblies and roofs. So building for resiliency. So when building for resiliency, I always recommend to understand your overall site, location, building environment. One of the reasons why is depending on where you're building and how you're building, this can prevent long-term issues for the home. Whether it be a specific type of slope that can affect water, or it can accumulate water against one side of the building. Understanding the layout of the land is going to help understand what needs to be done. I've been to many homes where they have a basement and it's full of water because they're downhill, and when it rains, it just sits there and pours into that area. And they could have done some mitigation, whether it be building, whether it be properly having the basement wall wrapped in a specific manner or some sort of moisture protectant, or even as simple as landscaping to help mitigate water directly attacking that side of the building. Also looking at events where you can prevent big issues such as flooding, where you build, whether it be on a hill or out of the flooding zones. And then, of course, considering what you're going to be doing around areas due to fire. And one of the things about these WUI zones is they're growing due to changes in weather and the lack of rain in a lot of areas. So if you're interested in more information, LP Corp Structural Solutions, and of course, if you're looking for how to survive a disaster, ready.gov and FEMA.gov/disaster are great sites for great information.
All right, thank you, Neil. Go ahead and send in your questions now using that questions box on the right side of your screen. Neil, I had a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. You were just talking a little bit about wildfire areas, and if we're talking about the resiliency of a home in a wildfire-prone area, how much of the battle is materials versus site preparation?
Sure, that's a great question. I couldn't tell you an exact percentage, but I would argue that it is an item of two potentials, right? So an item like where two things can affect it, right? So your site, whether it be real foresty or your building materials, right? So California has implemented specific type of louvers that will shut and prevent smoke or ash from coming up into attics, right? So that has nothing to do with the environment itself, because ash can be carried for miles. That has some sort of ember that can catch fire. So materials is a big thing. Making sure you understand what you're using and where you're using it, such as a louver. It's one of those things that is now required on new homes, but doesn't exist for older homes. So it's big. It's just one of those big items that the answer is basically yes to both, but as far as specifically, I'm not sure which one would be considered a greater threat, but those two things are pretty large in any sense of fuel per fire.
Okay. We did have a question from Matthew. He wanted to know, you mentioned the FEMA website, and with things like sea level rise and storm surge becoming a bigger thing, you've got the National Flood Insurance Program. You've got the potential on the horizon here for revised flood mapping done by FEMA and NOAA and possibly the Army Corps of Engineers, different agencies. They're looking at some of this stuff. The question is, what does LP offer when it comes to wanting to elevate a home? You know, it gets knocked out by a hurricane or a storm surge, and you know they still want that beautiful view, but they're going to now have to elevate the home, or else they're not going to be able to get the insurance, or they're not going to be able to get even a permit. What's offered there for assistance when you're talking about trying to elevate a home in a floodplain?
Sure. So that's a great question. Also, there's a combination of methodologies for construction. LP's materials have multiple options as far as whether it be from smart siding, the way it looks, or to the inside wall, the way it drains. A lot of it has to do with what the issue is, right? So if you're in a flooding zone, could you build on a pier and beam, right? Or have an elevated house, just like you would see off the coast in Jersey. So there's a lot more to it, but regardless of what you're trying to do, LP has a solution for structure, for flooring, for roofing, and siding. So we do have a big portfolio. It's not just the OSB, Tech Shield for energy. So there's a lot of options out there. I couldn't specifically say this will be the best solution for that situation, because the situation is a variable thing depending on where you're building and what you want to accomplish. But LP has a big portfolio that has plenty of information and solutions.
Okay. I had a question from Mike, not me, different Mike, who's attending here. He wanted to know if there's any methods of flood proofing for existing residences.
So that's a really good question. The last time I was involved with a lot of the FEMA work, they were working on developing a situation or a solution where you would potentially either spray foam the bottom 4 inches or 6 inches with some sort of a closed cell foam to help prevent any moisture from coming in. It's hard to say exactly. There are things that I would do personally, and I'll tell you here in a second what they are, for existing homes, and a majority of it has to do with the exterior, whether it be a landscape solution where you can help mitigate water, or if you're in a flooding plain, one of the biggest success stories is damming with sand, as far as like for the event. But to prepare a house for that, honestly, one of your biggest expenses, besides the tear out and clean up, is going to be HVAC. Most people end up having to buy new HVAC units, especially if they're on the ground. So I always recommend people elevate their HVAC units. I also recommend that people would board windows. I've seen a lot of windows break due to flooding. But yeah, I mean, as far as what to do, it'd be hard unless you're already opening up the wall. So if you're opening up the wall, there's more you can do. If you're just trying to prevent the damage, it's a little harder. But if you're opening up the walls, depending on what direction, there are solutions that you can use, whether it be a water preventive permeable paint, depending on your climate zone. I know that a lot of areas up north that use internal vapor barriers can and do benefit from that as waterproofing. There's some damage, but it's minimized.
Okay. I wanted to send out a final call for questions from our audience. I actually have another one for you, Neil. You talked about having the home very tight, but doing that in combination with an ERV or an HRV. What do you advise for homeowners who live in areas where they experience occasional power disruptions and they can't operate their mechanical systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that I'm going to say is currently there's probably only a handful of buildings that would be considered dangerously tight if there was a power failure. One of them being, a majority of them being some sort of building science nerd, along the lines of probably like a Matt Reisinger or Joe Seabright, right? So the key people. But the other concern, the other non-concern for me is that nothing would stop you from opening and closing doors, right? So as you're exiting and entering, you are letting a lot of fresh air in. So unless you have a specifically tight building where you have a power issue, battery backups, setting up some sort of power bank system or, generator, that would help. But in my experience, most homes are anywhere between 3 ACH50 and 7 ACH50. And that, even if they have power failures, that's not tight enough to be dangerous. Under 2.5 ACH50, we would be having a different conversation. So for the people in Canada, you be careful because your average is about 1.6.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the queue, so I want to go ahead and thank you, Neil, for sharing your time with us today and your knowledge, and thank you also to our audience. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Wait a minute. Before we go, I want to make sure to get in this question from Rob. Apologize, Neil. Rob wanted to know if there's any resources or resources on best practices or best practices for updating older home exteriors made up of a combination of both brick and cedar.
That's a great question. So in my experience, reaching out to a manufacturer is probably your best bet. If you were to reach out to us, I'd be more than happy to work with you, discuss all the options necessary. I know some other manufacturers do these services for free for people. Also, there are engineering groups out there that do this also. So one of the things that I recommend when looking at the complications is actually being able to have some sort of list of everything that's in the wall, rough age, if the exact, and materials, just so if someone wants to run like a hydrothermal model, whether it be Woofy or some other model, they have a better understanding of how the house works based on orientation, location, and climate. It's one of those tricky items when doing retrofits that you're kind of guessing at what the material is, condition it is, and the age it's at, to prevent any, extra swelling or items like that. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to reach out to a manufacturer who can help you.
All right. Well, like I said, I want to thank you very much, Neil, for being here today. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to LP Structural Solutions for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. Our next webinar is going to take place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, August 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be talking about the decarbonization economy. With a massive infrastructure bill that's ready to pass Congress, this will be the biggest step yet towards a sustainably focused economy. We're going to be joined by our very own Sarah Gutterman of Green Builder Media. Don't miss it. Until next time, stay safe out there. Take care, everyone. So long.